This is a really important time, I think, to talk about suffrage, talk about voting rights, and in a time when those voting rights are being challenged, being in some ways circumscribed and limited within our polity, our body politic. And I guess, one way to make this seem relevant to your students is to explain to them that in the early republic, um, people were coming into conflict, struggling about democracy and what that looked like. The subject of this talk are about, how that conflict unfolded, right? Rather than seeing democracy as a fully formed thing in any period, we should see how the concept itself was contested, and that should encourage us to rethink the idea of universal white manhood suffrage, which this is a concept and described in this way by historians, but we must grapple with the fact that, of course, universal white manhood suffrage wasn't very universal, right? On the one hand, the trajectory, the movement through the early republic from 1790 to 1850 did include states giving all adult white men the right to vote. And in global terms, that's revolutionary. That is a very wide electorate compared to other countries. But at that time, the reason why those quotation marks are around democracy is that this idea of universality was, of course, contested by people who were outside of the group of adult white men. So we'll get to some of the primary sources that I gave you of people like Robert Purvis and Angelina Grimke talking about the ways in which they believed that white women and African Americans ought to be part of a democratic polity, participating as democratic actors. But I want to talk about democracy in action at the polls, in Congress, but also in the streets, in associational life, and in practices, democratic practices other than voting, like petitioning. Those will all be part of the presentation today. The challenge with making a presentation about this subject is that I can't really do it satisfactorily or in a satisfying way because it's not a linear narrative, right? There's no national kind of standard for what the electorate was, and it's changing, therefore, state by state and even municipality by municipality. While I'm going to give you kind of the broad parameters of change during the early republic, I'm going to kind of, after I do that, talk about the contest about democracy in a few case studies from the 1830s and 1840s, kind of later on in the period. And I'm doing so in part because I think the best way to capture democracy in action is to show how conflict about suffrage rights mapped onto and intertwined with the struggle over abolition in the northern United States in the early republic, and the conflict between sections over the institution of slavery in the South. That around these issues, these intertwined issues, we really see democracy unfolding in front of us. All right. So I'm going to move to the next slide. There we go. Denver, in his talk on Monday, I suspect, kind of laid out for you some of the ideas about democracy in the late 18th century. We know the revolution was about the concept of the government by the consent of the governed, right? And so over the course of this period, the principle up for contest was defining who the people were in the phrase "we the people" in the Constitution. Unfortunately, as Denver might have mentioned, the Constitution doesn't provide much language to frame who the people were. There's a debate within a committee in the Constitutional Convention of 1787, which doesn't come to any agreement about the continuation of property requirements for voting. And so there's kind of a vague assertion that all people who can vote for the lower house of the legislature in states can vote for representatives in the House of Representatives at the national level. So again, this process of creating universal white manhood suffrage over the course of the early republic is one that happens state by state. And yet it also is intertwined with national politics. And I'll explain how that happens in my discussion of the case studies later. But as you may know, several states coming out of the revolution retained the property requirements for voting that had been the case in the colonial era. And that was because Americans believed that there ought to be a Republican basis for voting. And that's not a reference to a framework of government or a political party, but to a set of ideas about citizenship and the need for property holders to be the quintessential citizens, because they alone are incorruptible. They have the independence by virtue of their property holding that makes them able to use their free will in the political system. Dependent people, whether they be tenant farmers or wage laborers or within households, wives, children, enslaved people, were all dependent, and therefore under the kind of the aegis of republicanism thought to be inappropriate participants in the political system. And that was because the people who employed them, who owned their land, who governed them in households would be able to tell them how to vote, and that would corrupt the political system. There were efforts in the early republic to expand the notion of what the Republican basis could be. All right, that is to say that property holders were deemed the appropriate members of a voting class of the electorate because they had a stake in the society in which they lived. This was also true for people who resided in a place, and so there were residency requirements for voting that again varied state to state and municipality by municipality, but might be a very short amount of time, 6 months to a year. But this is all to say that transient people moving in and out of a place couldn't come in the day before of an election and vote. That was deemed to be fraudulent and corrupt. When this happened from time to time, people condemned it and tried to eradicate it. Taxpayers who may not own a certain amount of land could also make a claim that they too could be virtuous Republican citizens who had a stake in society. Right. And so several states over the course of this period relaxed property requirements and instituted taxpayer requirements into their state constitutions. There was also an effort, especially after wars, to provide soldiers with the right to vote. In a Republican sense, these men had virtuously sacrificed for the common good, put their lives in the line for the nation. And even if they didn't own property, the argument was that they too ought to be able to vote by virtue of their service to the nation. In some southern states, participation on slave patrols and keeping the slaveholding social order secure was also a reason put forward for why men should be able to vote if they did not meet a property requirement. On the other hand, the language of equality coming out of the revolution emerged and competed with, didn't eradicate, but competed with this Republican basis to explain who should be able to vote and why. Benjamin Franklin told a story of a man who had bought a donkey that was worth enough in property to qualify him to vote. And in the meantime, he read a lot about politics in newspapers, became an informed citizen. And yet the day before the election, the donkey died. And therefore that disqualified the man from voting. And Franklin, to his audience, asked the question, is the right to vote in the man or in the jackass? It's a question that reveals, I think, some of the kind of the increasing concerns that a lot of Americans had about these older property requirements, right? And coming out of a revolutionary tradition defined by the Declaration of Independence and the claim that all men are created equal, this tends to cast participating in voting in a different light. And it brings up, I know you guys read John Adams's letter, I think to Sullivan, right, where he says, you know, property holders have to be the voting citizens. If you give voting as a natural right, there will be no end to it, right? That's the concern among Adams and others. The one thing that Adams would have supported, and what certainly his rival in early Republic politics, Thomas Jefferson, supported, was to offer opportunities for more and more men to get hold of land. And so this kind of spurs westward expansion and kind of the imperial nature of the early American Republic. The kind of the move into the West, the dispossession of Native Americans, this was grounded in the kind of an effort among white politicians to make sure that white citizens could have access to the land necessary to be citizens according to the Republican basis. But on the other hand, at the same time, new states coming in to the Republic from Vermont in 1790 are allowing all adult white men over the age of 21 the right to vote. Between 1790 and 1855, when the Republic grows from 14 states to 31 states, all of those 31 states are going to have at least one state convention, a constitutional convention, in which they debate the apportionment of seats in the state legislature. These are questions of political power writ large, but they often move toward this standard of adult white manhood suffrage, right? And so my argument here is that it's pretty clear that the reasons they do so is because they're trying to establish the end that Adams wanted, that Adams said couldn't exist, right? That there would be a limit to who could be voters. And the reasons, the principal reason why they limited it to adult white men was because of the corresponding and intertwined process of emancipation in the North, and correspondingly the debate about abolition of slavery in the South. Many of these, the moves toward universal white manhood suffrage are also driven by the political parties of the time. in the time period I'm going to be focusing on in the case studies in the 1830s and 40s, these two parties are the Democratic Party and the Whig Party. The Democrats were typically in favor of enrolling propertyless workers and immigrants. The Whigs, who were typically maybe more middle class and elite individuals, were reticent, but they had to soften that stance in order to win more voters' allegiance. So as more voters are brought into the electorate, the parties take a really prominent role in mobilizing them to get to the polls, right? So on the one hand, what's happening here is the electorate is expanding from 60 to 70% of the white male population in 1792, of greater and greater numbers state by state over the course of this period. But what we're also seeing, and why this era often gets called an era of Jacksonian democracy, named after the man pictured here, Andrew Jackson, the figurehead of the Democratic Party, is that the electorate is expanded, but the number of people voting in elections also goes up. From maybe 45 to 50% at the beginning of this period to upwards of 80% of the electorate. So there are more people who are able to vote and also more people who were voting. And there is clear evidence that the parties were professionalized, more organized, and really mobilized people to get to the polls. And so as more and more voters came into the electorate, there was great competition among the parties to get to claim their votes. So I think I've explained kind of the broad trajectory of the expansion to universal white manhood suffrage in this period, the reasons why these limits to the electorate were made according to ideas about race, gender, and age, which I will elaborate upon further. But we should see how exclusive this was, and the reasons why. I think you will see in the case studies why and how people contested the exclusivity of universal white manhood suffrage. That is to say that while we often identify democracy in this period with the man pictured here, Jackson, and with the image of George Caleb Bingham's painting The County Election, which I've given you as a source, we often say in a textbook, like, this image shows what democracy looked like. We have to interrogate what Bingham painted here, which I will explain in one of my case studies. But also, I want you to give you kind of ideas about how you could teach your students to look beyond these images and this conceptualization of American democracy in this period to include the people who aren't pictured here. All right, so that's kind of the goal of the case studies that I've chosen. Okay. I'll get to these images in a minute, but I do want to contextualize what I've been talking about and kind of bring in the political conflict over emancipation in the North and abolition in the South, and how that was unfolding in the 1830s to help us understand a bit more clearly how Americans debated suffrage in the same period. As I said, I made the assertion earlier that the movement toward universal white manhood suffrage was related to the emancipation of enslaved people in the North. That's the clearest in the state of New York, where in the 1820s, 2 state constitutional conventions met to debate a wide variety of issues about the apportionment of legislative seats in the state. But very clearly, the concern was that if property requirements were done away with in the state, as many workers were clamoring for, would that bring in all of these African Americans who were recently freed? by a gradual emancipation law, which went into effect at the end of the 18th century in New York, but was so gradual that it wouldn't really fully take effect until the 1820s. So the concern here among racist white Northerners in New York State is, listen, I don't like this idea that that whiteness is no longer going to be very clearly the definition of freedom, right? So in these state constitutional conventions, a Democratic Party majority engineers the putting language into the bill that gives the right, the Constitution, to give the right to vote to all adult white men, and to leave and in fact increase the property requirements necessary for Black men to vote in the state. All right, so that happens all in the same decade that emancipation is finally going into full effect in New York State. So at the same time that all adult white men are getting the vote in New York, Black men still need to meet this very high property qualification to be able to vote there. At this time, organizations in the North were rising up, calling for the immediate abolition of slavery and the conferral of civil rights upon African Americans. Indeed, there were leaders of the abolition movement who mistrusted American politics. They looked at the Constitution as a pro-slavery document, and the power of slaveholders within the nation's government made that system corrupt. But I do want to make it clear too that a lot of abolitionists also believed that they could attain their goals through political means, and one means of democratic action was in their right to petition their government on a variety of issues, such as the end of the slave trade in the District of Columbia. Congress and not the states governed the District of Columbia, so abolitionists reasoned that slavery wasn't protected there in the same way that it was within each individual state. And so petitions were sent by abolitionist societies in the North, many of them written by women, and sent to congressmen like John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts, who presented them to Congress. These calls, once they were read to Congress, these calls to limit slaveholders' access to human property enraged Southern representatives, and they responded to these petitions with scorn, defending slavery as a benevolent relationship and institution, and chiding Northern abolitionist women to mind their place, to darn their stockings, to raise their children, and get out of politics. Slaveholders didn't stop there with criticizing Northern women. They put together legislative majorities in Congress to ban all petitions about slavery, the so-called gag rule, which Northern representatives like Adams portrayed as an infringement on white Northerners' liberties, their right to petition, their right to free speech. But slaveholders didn't stop there at the national level. They looked north, and they looked to states like Pennsylvania, where in the 1830s, Black men could vote. And they saw that as a dangerous symbol for enslaved people in their own states. They pressured Northern Democrats to limit the rights of African Americans in their states, and Pennsylvania's Democrats obliged in their state's constitutional convention of 1838. That constitutional convention was called to debate a more restrictive way of chartering banks in the aftermath of a debilitating financial panic in 1837. But the conversation quickly turned to suffrage rights and to move in the direction of New York. But the pressure, a lot of it, was coming from Southern slaveholders at the national level. And in an effort to keep a Democratic Party coalition together, North and South, Pennsylvania Democrats decided with a majority to clarify that suffrage rights in their state would henceforth only be enjoyed by white men. This act by this Constitutional Convention, coupled with the widespread violence of anti-abolitionist mobs against African Americans and white and black abolitionists in northern cities like Philadelphia, is the context for what Robert Purvis wrote in the document you read for today. Robert Purvis, the abolitionist from Philadelphia, who is depicted here in this slide. He provides many reasons for why African Americans were and should remain voting citizens of the Republic that we can talk about at the end of our discussion. This is also in the context of sectional conflict on the national level, the theft of rights by the slave power and their Northern Democratic allies, and violence on the streets, that an organization called the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society built their own building through widespread fundraising in their associations and auxiliaries. And they built this building for their own meetings, given the fact that they were under such pressure and under the threat of violence on city streets. It was hard for them to book other buildings, so they built one for themselves. It had an anti-slavery bookstore, office space for the society, room for a printing press for an abolitionist newspaper, and a large lecture hall. It went up in 1838, right after the state constitutional convention closed its meeting, and it went up in the shadow of the Liberty Bell atop Independence Hall, where the nation's clarion call to liberty was sounded in the Declaration. The hall opened to much fanfare on Monday, May 14th, 1838. That night, Angelina Grimke, the woman depicted here, a South Carolinian who had moved to Philadelphia because of her disgust at slavery and because she had become a formidable advocate for abolition and women's rights. You've read a document by her for our discussion too. The first event in Pennsylvania Hall was her marriage, what was billed as the abolitionist wedding of the century, to Theodore Weld, another prominent figure in the abolition movement. The wedding was attended by William Lloyd Garrison and other national leaders of the abolition movement. It was attended by two Black women who had been enslaved by the Grimke family, whose freedom Angelina had purchased. And they ate a wedding cake made by a free African-American confectioner who used sugar made by free labor. So everything about this wedding was political in nature, symbolic though that may be. This is a very clear statement of abolitionist principles. On Tuesday morning, the day after the wedding, the hall hosted the first meeting of the Anti-Slavery Convention of American Women. Anti-abolitionists on the streets around the hall were shocked to see a man they thought was white escort a Black woman arm in arm into the hall. The white man was Robert Purvis. Three of his grandparents were white and from Britain. His maternal grandmother was from North Africa and had been sold as a slave in the transatlantic slave trade in Charleston, had been freed, and so before Robert was born. And so Robert moved to Philadelphia as a young man and identified as an African-American man and used his sizable inheritance from his British merchant family to support anti-slavery causes. He married Harriet Fortin, the daughter of a prominent Black Philadelphia abolitionist. It's these interracial couplings, men perceived to be white escorting Black women and Black men escorting white women, that enrages white racists on the streets of Philadelphia. They call these meetings promiscuous, quote unquote, with all of those social and sexual connotations, these intimacies that they called disparagingly amalgamation. And so anti-abolitionists make the argument that abolitionists say they want political rights for African Americans, but what they actually want is social and sexual rights that will lead to race mixing. So whipped into a fervor by what they saw on the streets, the racist crowd turned violent on the night of Wednesday, May 16th, throwing rocks and brickbats, shattering windows, scaring the women who were meeting in this anti-slavery society, many of whom in the audience wanted to pack up their stuff and run out of the building. But Angelina Grimke-Weld stands up and says, we're not leaving. This is really important business, and we have to take a stand. What if the mob should now burst in upon us, she asked, break up our meeting and commit violence against our persons? Would this be anything compared with what the slaves endure? That brought everybody to attention and allowed them to continue the meeting despite this violence that's happening outside. On Thursday, anti-abolitionists called on the city's mayor, John Swift, to stop these meetings in which white and black men and women sat together in what they conceived of as a dangerous way. Abolitionists asked Swift to send a police force to protect their proceedings and the hall. Instead, Swift took the keys to the building and shut down the meetings. He told the howling mob to go home and to bed. The mob, as you see here, had other ideas, lighting fires and burning the place to the ground. Grimke and Purvis had both spoken and written eloquently for the rights of women and African Americans to participate in the body politic. The crowd of white men who burned Pennsylvania Hall demonstrated the violent lengths to which they would go to keep, quote unquote, universal white manhood suffrage exclusive. So that's one way in which suffrage, the debate about suffrage, was intertwined with debates about race, emancipation, and slavery and abolition, as it unfolded in Pennsylvania. These same concepts are intertwined in different ways in other states, right? In Rhode Island, there were different sort of circumstances which came to the fore, which shaped the circumstances of these debates. One reason why many advocates of expanding the suffrage to non-property holders, one reason they gave was that the United States was in very little danger of developing a working class, a permanent working class like in England in the midst of its industrial revolution. America's manufacturing sector was modest in the early republic, located in big northern cities and textile mill towns in New England. But in Rhode Island, industrialization had really taken hold. And the political elite there was reluctant to expand the suffrage because such a large swath of its adult male population, native-born and increasingly foreign-born, particularly Irish and Catholic, were working for low wages in the state's factories. These were the dependent people who, according to the Republican basis, were not very reliable as citizens. Rhode Island's government still operated under the colonial charter, which had been issued in 1663 by King Charles II. And most white men could not meet the property qualification for voting, which was $134 in land. And working class leaders in Rhode Island had long been advocating for getting rid of that requirement, situating propertyless workers' Republican virtue in the hard labor they did, and arguing that the charter did not provide Republican government to the state as required by the US Constitution. The movement to expand the suffrage in the state gained momentum when a lawyer and son of a textile mill owner named Thomas Wilson Dorr, pictured here, took up its standard. He and his People's Party organized a people's convention, a suffrage convention in late 1841 that voted for a new constitution that provided universal white manhood suffrage, that they sent to town meetings where it was ratified across the state. But the leaders of the charter government declared that Dorr and other leaders of the People's Party were committing treason. So there was basically, Rhode Island now had two governors operating under different constitutions, and they were clearly going to come into conflict with each other. In May of 1842, Dorr led a group of 200 followers to the state arsenal in Providence to try to take control of it and the weapons there. They tried to fire a 70-year-old cannon, which failed to ignite, and their efforts were beaten back, and Dorr fled into exile. In Rhode Island, the charter government, now styling itself the Law and Order Party, arrested hundreds of Dorr supporters and crushed the movement. Included in the military force arresting the Dorrites were some 200 African-American men. Like the white men of the People's Party, African-American men without property had also not been able to vote under the charter. Those who met the property requirement had been disfranchised on account of race in 1822. African-Americans were, at the time that Dorr sought the vote for white workers, advocating for their own suffrage rights. They had their own suffrage association. They petitioned to the People's Convention in 1841 to not limit the vote to white men, to be more inclusive. And over the objections of Dorr, who wanted to do that very thing, the People's Party decided to make the right to vote the exclusive preserve of white men. The black men in Providence and other places of Rhode Island responded by joining forces with the Law and Order men. And as a result, when the Law and Order Party sought to stave off further rebellions by revising its constitution at the end of 1842 and 1843, black men got the right to vote. You can see the ballot initiative here, in which the question was whether the word white should appear as a modifier for who can vote, and the answer by majority was no. At the same time, though, that black men got the right to vote in Rhode Island, foreign-born men still needed to meet a property requirement. Those foreign-born men, many of them remember, were part of the Dorr Rebellion. All right, so that's a qualification that existed in Rhode Island through the 1850s. It was one of the last property qualifications to give way in this move toward universal white manhood suffrage. But in this instance, black men are getting the right to vote because they upheld a very restrictive government against the forces promoting universal white manhood suffrage. To conclude with this image that I want to focus a lot of our time in discussion, I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that this image sometimes appears in our textbooks as the picture of American democracy in the early republic. George Caleb Bingham's The County Election, painted in 1852. I said that this, in fact, does represent American democracy, quote unquote democracy, and we need to identify the ways in which it does, as well as what it doesn't. I think you also need to know that this painting is not just allegory. It's a painting of a particular election, an election about which the artist, George Caleb Bingham, was particularly aggrieved. In 1846, after painting some of his most famous works depicting the flatboatmen of the Missouri River, Bingham ran as the Whig Party's candidate for a seat in the Missouri State Legislature from Saline County. The election took place in the county seat of Arrow Rock, which was near Bingham's home. That's the town that's portrayed here. His opponent was the Democrat, who has a wonderful name, Erasmus Darwin Sappington, E.D. Sappington. Bingham won this election by 3 votes, but Sappington, with the help of his brother-in-law, county judge, and former Missouri Governor Meredith Marmaduke, another great name, and a Democratic majority in the state legislature, got 4 of Bingham's votes thrown out, including the vote of an Irish immigrant named John Murphy, who had served in the U.S. Army during the War of 1812, some 30 years before, but had lost his naturalization papers. Bingham himself made connections between race and Republican citizenship in his speech about after his victory was overturned. You can understand how angry he is without accepting some of the racist aspersions he makes in this quotation. But let me read it to you to give you his mindset. When many of us now assembled were yet reposing in our mother's arms, when British bayonets brightened on every side, and the tomahawk and scalping knife glanced in the lurid glare by the savage torch, then it was, sirs, that the man whose right, yes, whose right of citizenship I am now defending, stepped forward as a volunteer and bared his bosom to the blast. Racist aspersions aside about Native Americans, you can see here the continued power of the Republican basis for citizenship. So I want to kind of remind you, the questions that I'm asking are, what did George Caleb Bingham think American democracy looked like? Who were citizens and what did they do at the polls? And then what did Angelina Grimke and Robert Purvis think American democracy was and should be? What made a citizen in their estimation? But I also, in looking at this painting, I want to know what you think, what role slavery played, to connect it to my previous remarks, what slavery played in this election that Bingham is depicting here. All right, and that's a harder question to answer, I admit, but it's one that I think we should do. I did want to point out to you before our discussion, just to identify some of these people. These are actual people in the image. You can see here, this guy I'm circling with my cursor, that's Sappington. This guy is Marmaduke, the county judge and former governor. This guy is Murphy, the Irish immigrant voter. And this guy is Bingham. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A period and to our discussion. So I'll stop there.